Good morning, Coalition. It's great to see everybody today, and a happy February 4th to you. So we've got Shane Lukas, but first of all, we'll just have a quick announcement. We have our executive committee meeting coming up in another week, and so those who are part of that know that they will have an invitation for that, and then we'll have our general monthly meeting the week after that. But we continue to have Friday Facts and moving forward. So I'm going to just move right into this wonderful interview. And again, we've got Shane Lukas with us. Shane is the owner of A Great Idea. You all have known him for a long time, I believe, because he has been helping us in all kinds of ways around technology and development of what we're doing in communications, advocacy, and education. And so welcome, Shane.
Hey, everybody. Nice to be here. It's unusual to be on this side of the conversation.
Yes, and it's something you have successfully avoided for a good while, but that's okay. We got you now. So tell us, please, about your growing up, where you grew up, and a little bit about who Shane Lukas is.
Well, first of all, I love this because I've heard so many of everyone's stories in the coalition, so it's kind of a joy to be able to share a little bit here. My story is a bit more convoluted, so I'll keep it relatively short. But I was raised in the Midwest, born and raised in Illinois, but I would say very much of middle-class trauma. So I come from a home that was rife with everything from alcoholism to infidelity to a variety of things all the way through my childhood. So divorces, so on and so forth. And so pretty much my family went through varying splits and challenges throughout that time. And I think that kind of formed for me, that kind of instability kind of formed for me a sort of a base in empathy, I think. Just kind of getting through some of those experiences from divorce when I was in second grade. Both my parents remarried by third grade, and one married an alcoholic, the other one married someone who was abusive, and kind of moved through these sort of processes until my mother actually was diagnosed with cancer when I was in fourth grade. And so from fourth to sixth grade, I spent most of the time, custody went to my mother for me. I have two brothers. They were actually divided up between my father and my mother. And so with my mother, I spent about 2 years kind of volleying between, if anybody knows, Ingalls in Chicago and some other hospitals there, and basically going through cancer treatment with my mother. So she was one of the first women in America to get the bone marrow transplant, which now is a relatively normal procedure. At the time, it was a bit experimental. So she was, I think, one of the first 2, 3, 4, 5 women in America to get it. And it did not take. She ended up passing when I was in sixth grade. And from sixth grade on, I ended up, there was a big custody battle. I ended up in my father's house, which was all alcoholics. So that was, I pretty much spent time between 7th through the time I went to college, kind of dealing with a household that was very solidly middle class for the most part. Again, my father was a recruiter. We don't use the term headhunter anymore, but that is essentially what he was doing. And then my I'll be diplomatic. My stepmother was a failed actress who was a very successful alcoholic, and she had 7 children from 4 previous marriages. It was a very complicated, weird network of things. My brothers are older than me. I'm the youngest. I'm the baby. So that always yields its thing. And at one point with my step family, I was the youngest of 10. And so that was also sort of an awkward kind of, scenario. But my brothers now live, one in the UK and the other one lives in Massachusetts. And we all kind of fled as soon as we could. So that was pretty much childhood. And then I went to college.
Let me just stop you for a second. So you went through caregiving when you were really young. You were essentially, you were visiting your mother in the hospital, but you were doing caregiving and you experienced this death of your mother, who was very close to you. And you're saying that with a smile, but I know that it had to have caused some pain. So if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit about what that felt like.
Yeah, and I guess I smile. In some ways, I made peace with a lot of it. Again,
Sure.
it was a lot to process. It's not like she could control what was happening to her through the process. She did everything she could during that time. And when you're 9, you're not doing direct caregiving, in that she's not looking to me for direct support. She's trying to be as much of a mother as she can be during that time, and that itself is a huge challenge. And so at one point I wrote a piece in high school, sort of going through what it was like when she eventually passed, and kind of what occurred. Because one thing about cancer is that you have a long time to go through the hospitals and spending a lot of time playing solitaire with your grandmother in a waiting room, and every we were in Central Illinois, so it was like a 2-hour drive back and forth to the hospitals. And so you'd spend the entire weekend basically going into these hospital rooms. But it's hard for me to even imagine what she was going through when her children are kind of sitting there. She's doing everything she can to recover. She was bedridden for a long period of time, but there was a point at which she was actually in remission, which is for me a really emotional time, because it was the first trip I ever took out of Illinois. She took me because I'm the baby, and my brothers still resent this. She took me to go see family on the West Coast, and it was really the first time on a plane. It was the first time she'd really been able to leave anything other than a hospital for a really long time. And so she took me to go see some more distant family on the West Coast. And so for about a week and a half, she was in remission. Things were looking good. She was feeling really good about stuff. And it was really time with her that I honestly, again, after a year and a half being in the hospital, we had not really had the same kind of time. And so to me, that those times are really, really significant. When we got back, she was re-diagnosed that the cancer had sort of again kind of come back with full force. And so it was really her only time away from all of that. And so, again, I'm not gonna cry, but like it's very it was really the for her. It was really, I think, a very meaningful experience, and certainly was for me too. And so, that sort of caregiving side from being a young person who's, not really be able to process everything that's going on, at the same time having the ability to reconcile that. I mean, we all knew she was going to pass about 4 or 5 months before she did, and I think that was a lot. I still don't. It probably took me years to unpack that after that.
So Ellie Shucraft made a comment in the chat here, and she said, "This is an incredible story. I imagine your mother would have been so proud of how you have used that experience to shape your work now." Comment on that, if you don't mind.
That's a tough one. I appreciate that, Ellie, a lot. It's hard to say, right? Like, I think about this also in terms of being queer identified, right? Like that there are things that I don't know would have turned out the same way. We can't really change our story. She was an incredible woman. She went to school. She was a teacher. She was a chemist. It's probably how actually she may have gotten cancer. It's possible. She was a chemist in rubber manufacturing for Caterpillar. So there's certainly a lot of potential because this is the 70s and 80s, and what are regulations anyways? So who knows, what may have impacted that. And so, it's hard to say, because I think about it, and I'll use a quick story. When I lived in Europe, I lived in Italy for 3 years. And so I would go back and forth. My partner was Milanese, and I'd be on the train. And I was on a train once, and there was a woman who was on the same car who I swear would have looked like if my mother had continued to live. Because again, side note, my partner at the time, his mother is the exact same age, year, and date as my mother. And so there was I could have had a reference point for that was not intentional. It was, but a reference point for kind of what aging would have been like for my mother. And there was this woman on the train who I thought was like, my mother never left the country. My mother barely left the state. And so this idea that she would have eventually gone on to travel, to do things, to see all of her sons go on to do something with their lives and build families and do all of this, I would love to think that she would have really welcomed that. And I think I try to honor that and honor her. in some ways by living fully, because I don't think she had that opportunity. And for me, that was what I took a lot from her passing early, was you have to live as fully as possible.
Yeah, yeah. You've passed, you've moved in time, and appropriately so, but and we've talked about this. So I would love for you to share a little bit about, I mean, you struggled with the family then that you got thrown into, and you had a alcoholic stepmother, and your dad was alcoholic, and there was a lot of dysfunction there. And I know, because I know you, we've chatted about this in the past, but take us just a little bit into how you came out and what that felt like.
Yeah, it's interesting because, that period was a lot about resilience. Obviously, dealing with my mother's death was, I went into kind of, I would say, a mental coma after that. I pretty much went to school and did TV. I would say, very inactive for about a couple of years. And then when I came out of it, it was a lot of just internal reflection. I'm not a person of faith, but I do respect, again, a lot of faith participants. But for me, what kind of informed moving forward was recognizing that there is a gratitude that has to be present all the time. And so I started at 14 working with Planned Parenthood, and working in women's reproductive health, and sort of really taking on activism and empathy early on. Because part of it was, for me, you can really be supportive to people. You can really be, and this is where harm reduction comes in. So I don't know if this is, again, I don't want to detour too far, but like harm reduction, before I understood what harm reduction was, made a lot of sense to me, which is a non-judgmental approach to making sure that you support where people are and that you're helping them get the resources they can to make the best decisions possible. And so it's not my place to make those decisions, it's my place to support that. And so even in my own sort of process and coming out and all of these experiences, and really what brought me to activism and whether, again, it's supporting serious illness care, supporting other sort of areas of social justice, it was really informed by this idea that, like, we don't all get to control all the factors that are going to impact all of our story, but we can also be intentional about the way we want to write that story. And so for me, that story really centers on, am I contributing or am I supporting the wellness of the people who are around me, and including myself? Like, you have to do some self-care, like that's a reality. But being able to contribute in that way was something I learned early on, because at home it was a mess. And you could watch decisions and bad decisions being made one day after another, one day after another. And so being able to be able to impact people who don't want to make bad decisions, but just don't have information, just don't have access to the tools. And you're like, hey, you know what? It's not my place to judge where you want to be, whether that's, again, responsible drug usage or alcohol usage or whatever it is you want to do. I don't judge it. Like, I'm not a teetotaler. I'm like, whatever you want to do, but please get the information. Please get all the information as much as possible. And the same goes, this is why I think it's very resonant for me with serious illness care and a lot of the work that we're doing that combines both behavioral healthcare and also healthcare access. Because to me, those things are very powerful in giving people agency to, and David, you've said this before many, many times, right? Being able to own your own health. To be able to own your own decisions means actually having the facts and the resources in place to make those decisions. And that's just something that's really guided all my decisions, as from my teenage to college years, where I wanted to be a journalist, because I thought the more information people would get access to, the more opportunities that they could make better decisions, like the more facts they got. And in this era of weird facts and not facts and Fox News, things that, like facts are a little more questionable. Then I thought the more facts that people got, then the better decisions they would make. And that came from me too. Like, the more facts I could get, the more information I learned about people, the more I could hear their stories and understand the depths and complexities of people's decision-making. And that's where, even with women's reproductive health, it was so critical for me to hear stories that were of my peers, young women who did not have access or control over their, access to care, access to information, access to support. And I was like, well, and then they would get blamed for decisions that were not theirs, or were difficult, or were challenging, or were hard. Like, I can't even process. And so being able to be in a position to be supportive wherever their decisions lead them, to me, that was something that, again, was just very impactful. And I have incredible mentors who certainly helped me understand that, even as a teenager.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So, tell us about, as you spoke, it occurred to me, I know that when you said people are getting blamed for decisions they made, when have you been blamed for a decision, and what was the outcome? How did that work through? Think about something that you personally have engaged in that.
I mean, that's interesting. You know, I, as an activist, especially as a queer activist, I came out when I was very young. I came out when I was 17, and queer liberation and that narrative means a lot to me. And by that, I mean that anybody along the sort of gender identity, gender spectrum, sexual identity spectrum, gender expression spectrum, it's a pretty inclusive idea. But that part of queer liberation is in some ways making sure that we are recognizing all members of individuals who identify along that spectrum. And as somebody who comes with privilege, and while it was a very unstable childhood, and I would say we were, you know, volleyed between middle class and probably upper lower income, you know, family, I've always had privilege. I'm a white, cis, educated male. Like, I have all of these resources there. How I expend social capital matters. And so I've always taken chances. And so I get blamed, or I have been blamed in the past for things, taking stances on things. And I'll use one example is around sex work decriminalization. That area is really important to me, because for those of us who are queer identified, our rights stem from individuals who worked in this area, who really had either no opportunity or relished the agency of that opportunity. And they went and they took stances, whether it's Stonewall or Compton's cafeteria riots or ACT UP or any of these particular places. Historically, any of those advances are traced to individuals who made choices that not everyone in America is going to agree with. Most people in America may not understand. And yet at the same time, my liberation, my freedom, the ability for me to have these conversations actually stems from that. And so I've taken a lot of stances. For 2 decades, I've taught around how individuals in those industries can access healthcare, can access resources, mental health support, all of those things, and all with a non-judgmental approach. Again, that's something. And so in terms of, you know, you talked about like where I've been held accountable. I'll use one example. Is I was employed by one company. I won't name them because now it's a sealed lawsuit, or it's closed and all that kind of stuff. But basically, I've done that activism for many years. In addition to other work around racial justice and economic justice. They Googled my name at the time and decided to fire me for doing the activist work, and that activist work was in conjunction with GMHC out of New York and Night Ministry out of Chicago and all these national organizations, but they were very uncomfortable with the content, and which was ironic because it was a publication and they actually made money off the ads of massage therapists or massage workers in varying parts of their industry. So it was a very, again, like one of those places of being held accountable for the activism, but, you know, I could also recover. Like I recovered from it and I can recover from that. So I continued at it and I continue at it every day. That is one of the benefits of this job and my work, is being able to continue to do social justice work integrally to my work.
You are a resilient person, and having known at least a fair bit of your background, I've seen that you have bounced back and you've been very resilient, and boy, hats off to you for how you've done that. Catherine has a question that she wants to
I
pose.
do, and I have several, but I'll limit it to one at the moment. And that is, you and I've talked before about your journey with helping in the HIV crisis and how that shaped some of what you think about as far as serious illness and other things. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and also about where you see the HIV movement now and what's undone about that?
Those are great questions. So obviously my first introduction to HIV is working in sexual health and reproductive health, even in my teens. Although at that time it was very much in its infancy, especially in rural Illinois. It was not well talked about. By the time I went to college, which was in central Iowa at Drake University, I had come out. I was kind of, I was getting comfortable with the idea of what this is pre sort of the queer identity in some ways. But I was very comfortable with who I was. And over time, I've been introduced to a number of people in the community. And one of them, Mark, who's still very very meaningful to me. He was the first person that I met who was living with HIV at the time, and had sort of, I built up a great friendship with him. I been one of my best friends for many years. And then as he was ostracized from his family, so he was one of those examples of, especially in the, I would say, again, late 80s, early 90s, of an individual who disclosed their identity and disclosed their status, and was completely abandoned by their family. So just no family relationships, and a lot of homophobia, a lot of fear around HIV at the time, obviously in Central Illinois. And so as he was fine, his health was fine. He was maintaining in the way that the meds would allow at the time. Again, this is very much in the early AZT kind of phase. And then as his health deteriorated, I spent a lot of my junior and senior years of college, not just doing school and my internships, but also really doing caregiving with Mark. So going over, taking care of him. The last 6 months, particularly brutal, as he lost different bodily functions, as he lost different processes, as again, a Kaposi sarcoma, which is, it's a skin infection. It's a bacterial infection. Those types of things start to show up and become more prominent. He starts to lose mental faculties a bit. So, different things started to fall apart. And so it was a lot because there was no real primer for that information. And so as a college student trying to figure out like how to do this, I like to think I'm pretty resourceful. And I was, as much as I could be, with him, and certainly, reached out to a couple other members of our community who, could be supportive through that process, especially if some things were just getting beyond the reach of what my certainly capacity was at all. So it was difficult to watch. It was difficult to go through the process. It was difficult for him to go through the process. Again, this is Central Iowa. There were not a lot of resources that were affirming. There were not a lot of resources that were supportive at this point. Now, again, thankfully, Iowa's gone on to process gay marriage even. But at the time, this is 1994, 95, that was not in the air. And so again, I would say that process and walking him through hospice and going through that process has been a lot. Now, and as a sort of counterhead to that, my friend Hal, who just recently passed about a year and a half ago at the beginning of the pandemic, he lived with HIV for 36 years. And so he'd been a good friend of mine for many years. And so he, his process and his going through hospice, and we had conversations as he was going through his last few days of hospice, and he had a very different, obviously, process. He was ready to process many of these things and able to go through it. Mark, I would say, was very much a mix of confusion and pain, and so trying to mitigate that as much as possible with what we could.
So you've been a caregiver in a number of settings, and as this organization is continuing to explore how best to approach not only caregiving, but advanced care planning and so forth. And you've been certainly very, very engaged with our Mind My Health approach. And what thoughts do you have around the whole nature of identifying a power of attorney or an advocate, particularly as it relates to the LGBTQ community here? And we've talked about this a little bit, but share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, again, great question, because not all of us have family or blood family. I'll use blood family is probably a better word to refer to it. I'm very lucky that I have a great circle support family, and that they're incredible. Those types of things, when I first bought property, was kind of my my introduction to this, and so the first house was again a life sort of milestone moment, and so it was a good chance for me. And I just thought of it as an adult. This is an adult thing to do, to look after my responsibilities, and part of my responsibilities was doing that kind of advanced care planning at the time. So this is before you and I had been introduced, before I'd worked on Mind My Health and worked with the coalition. So I'd already had a lot of these documents in when we first started talking, and part of that was really informed by there's no one to look after me. And Mark, Mark's experience certainly informs that. Other experiences I've had since that with individuals who are queer identified, again, in terms of their family relationships and how they have either handled or not handled their affairs and their responsibilities as they age. I'll be honest, I didn't think I was going to live past 30. Like many of us who grew up in that era, that was the expectation. We thought we would die. So, you know, if you do a survey of people probably my age and over, like they're like, retirement wasn't really a thing that we really contemplated. You know, my friend Hal, I mentioned, you know, 30 plus years, you know, living with HIV, like there were multiple times he was like, I think I'm done. I probably should do something. Like, it's like, and you know, he went through this in multiple phases. He didn't expect it to live as long as he did, and thankful for treatments and medications and systems that live out there that manage that. But that went for many of us who live, you know, again, violence against queer people is still significant, especially if you are a person of color, if you are a trans person of color, if you live a transgender experience. All of these things, like those violences are still present, they're still there. But there is still the perception, especially amongst certain parts of the community. And I'll say mostly rural, again, communities of color, communities who may not have a high resource, may not have a high wealth, that there is a shorter lifespan. And if you look at stats on lifespans, they're not great. They're not exciting. They are not happy especially for trans women of color. And so the reality there is significant around what this type of planning means, around what this type of conversation means. But I think it's also validating to build up a resource that will look after you if you are unable to speak for yourself. I think that conversation is really relevant. And so finding and building and really legally articulating what that means can be also really powerful for community members whose if their family swoops in, may not understand that they're on HRT treatment, that they may not understand hormone treatment, they may not understand any of these things. And the last thing we want is someone to be in care and just not getting the kind of affirming information that they deserve.
Yeah, that's very important. Thank you. I see Heather Burkhart put in her, as she calls it, shameless plug. The Coalition on Aging is having a training entitled "Creating Inclusive Environments for LGBTQ Aging Adults," and certainly Shane has been an advocate for all those things along the way. Continually, you're always pushing us, Shane, to be more inclusive, to be more diverse, to have more equity concern, and that is making us better. Well, let's see, we've got 2.5 minutes left. You're also a poet, and I want to just acknowledge that. Tell us a little bit about your poetry and what you're doing with that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've been a writer most of my life. I probably get less time to do it these days, part of running the business. A great idea is 7 years old. It's a care and community brand communications company. So I spend a lot of time doing writing and designing and other pieces, whether it's copy. But in terms of creative writing, I don't get as much time as I would like. But I do, as you mentioned, have a history there. I've been writing most of my life. I was actually in a book that was banned. It was one of the top banned books in the 1990s and 2000s called Revolutionary Voices, that was specifically for queer young people. And so I was one of the first authors in one of those first queer banned books. So that's fun. And then I've been in a number of different books over the years, in different anthologies and other pieces, things like that. I don't get enough opportunity to really spend some time writing. Hey, David.
So,
I was going to say, so I think spoken word poetry is still very critical and important to me, and it's still part of what I try to make time for. So I'm hoping to do more writing. That is on my year's intention list.
So are you getting ready to do anything publicly that people could follow?
Spoken word wise, nothing. But I will say, you mentioned Heather Burkhart's got the panel, which is great. I encourage everyone to check that out. I'm actually just got announced I'll be speaking at the Create Good conference as well. I'm going to be doing a workshop about speaking queer and creating affirming brand narrative for any organization that's interested in those conversations. So feel free to reach out to me about that. I just got a notification about that yesterday. So I do speaking engagements now and again, but in terms of spoken word stuff, not yet. I mean, not since I should. I miss it, but that's part of the pandemic. I mean, there's we don't get as many opportunities to do public events. So, but I'm happy to share if people want to stay connected. I'm happy to share some of that.
Your emotions come out so much in your spoken word. We've had the privilege of being able to hear you a time or two, and man, it is powerful, and it encourages us to think differently.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Again, I think any creative expression, and I think we can all speak to the power of that, is cathartic, and it's a way to share. It's a way to build empathy, and it can be fun. And sometimes that the need to channel those emotions is important. So I thank you, everyone, the opportunity to be part of the coalition. It's really been a joy to join everybody and spend time with everybody.
Thank you for joining us today in this capacity, Shane, and we look forward to hearing more about what you're engaged in as things move forward.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Thanks for your comments and engagement. You all have a great week.
Thank you.